timely and voluntary manner and disclose it, they're going to treat us like a good company, not like a bad company, right? What this means is that prosecutors in the United States, they expect good companies to self-report major compliance problems. So what does a prosecutor do to investigate and find compliance problems? Sits by his phone, waits for it to ring, and for someone to make an appointment. This is similar in the antitrust area. Those of you who are familiar with Japanese antitrust would know about the leniency program that the JFTC has, right? The US Department of Justice has a leniency program, the European Union has one, the European Commission has one. If you have three companies and they're in a cartel, a price-fixing cartel or bid rigging, and one of them goes in and reports it, they get a discount, right? Maybe they get half the penalty. So there's a strong incentive if you're in a cartel with two of your competitors to go rat them out, go report, and then you get no fine, and then the other two get a big fine. So the antitrust enforcer can just sit by their phone and wait for the one member of the cartel to come in. Or more likely what often happens is you have this happened in the semiconductor memory business a decade or so ago, where some of the memory companies, and this was just DRAM, it wasn't flash memory, back in the days of when there were a number of companies making DRAM, and the price was too low, and they had a price-fixing arrangement, and one of them went in and got leniency, brought in the other two companies in the cartel, and when the second company or the third company is negotiating a settlement and a guilty plea and a penalty, one thing the prosecutors ask is, well, can you tell us about any other antitrust problems that you're aware of? And so the company, I think it was Hynix, said, well, yeah, actually, now that you mention it, we'd like to self-report this other problem to get back at our competitors who reported us on this one, because we're price fixing on another product. So you saw that there were a number of problems in the same industry, and they were all self-reported by one of the members in the cartel. So, so the first step is self-reporting. And the second step is you want to cooperate in the investigation of its agents. This was one of the most controversial things in the Thompson memo. This was interpreted to say that you actually had to get, you really had to twist the arms of the individuals and get them to waive attorney-client privilege and get them to go in if you wanted to be treated as a good company. And you had to fire the individuals, cut them off, do things that put a lot of pressure on them to settle. And this was seen as unfair by corporate America. They didn't like this, and they complained a lot about it. They complained that you were coercing people to waive their constitutional rights and putting some of the individuals in a position where it's hard to defend the lawsuit. And so the McNulty memo took that out. You don't see anything about attorney-client privilege waivers in this memo. Okay, the existence and adequacy of the corporation's pre-existing compliance program is factor number 5, right? So if you don't want them to prosecute you criminally, you'd better have a good compliance program in place and show them that you are trying to comply with the law and that this was just an isolated failure, right? You have a good compliance program in place, and of course, as in-house lawyers, that's part of your everyday work, is making sure that the company has good compliance programs in place. 6th factor, the corporation's remedial actions, including any efforts to implement an effective corporate compliance program or improve an existing one, to replace management, to discipline or terminate wrongdoers, to pay restitution. You know what restitution is? That means basically compensating the victims of whatever happened, and to cooperate with the relevant government agencies. Again, did you fix the problem? If you had a rogue manager, did you fire them or did you promote them? Enron was famous. They had, in the early days of Enron, they had one business that made a lot of money, which involved oil trading. And there were a couple of years when that was where all their profits were coming from. And the people doing the oil trading business were lying, cheating, stealing, making false documents, doing all of these terrible things. And the management found out about it. They did an internal investigation. And the CEO, Ken Lay, said, you know, they're the only ones making me money. I need those guys. I'm not going to fire them. I'm not going to shut down that business. They're the only ones making me money. And that set the compliance environment in Enron that existed over the next decade until the company went under, frankly. And it was, everyone in the company saw that. They learned the lesson that it's more important to make money than it is to follow the rules. And so that's the type of thing that the Justice Department is going to consider when they decide whether to bring a criminal case. Okay, collateral consequences, including disproportionate harm to shareholders, pension holders, and employees, not proven personally culpable. Volkswagen, they've got hundreds of thousands of employees, and the number of engineers who knew about this software thing was probably, you know, I don't know how many, but you could probably count them on both hands, right? So you're punishing hundreds of thousands of people, you're punishing pension holders, you're punishing communities where they have to shut down a factory because a few people did a bad thing, right? So if you punish a company, you're hurting the innocents, right? You buy stock in a company, they lie to you about what's on their financial statements, and then it turns out that the stock price goes down because they lied to you about the financial statements. The regulator comes and gives them a penalty. That just hurts you. The stock price goes down even further. So that's one thing you have to think about when you think about whether to go after a company or not. And then finally, the adequacy of remedies such as civil or regulatory enforcement actions. Okay, so that's what was set up in the Thompson memo and the McNulty memo. I think this was 2003 and then 2006. And that basically set the theme for the next decade, almost the next decade. Let's look at one other theme, which is going after the individuals. Let's see if I can revive this or not. There, okay. There, okay. Okay, I put a nice gallery of rogues here to take a quick look at. Enron. As I mentioned, I was a lawyer in Washington, D.C. when all these things were going on, right? Jeff Skilling, he was the CEO of Enron when they went under. Ken Lay was the chair. And he was actually, his lawyer was in my firm and had the office right next door to mine, in the same hallway. Bruce Heiler, and yeah, here's a picture of them. There's Bruce, and Jeff Skilling testifying to Congress when Enron was going bankrupt. You know, and he went to jail for a long time. 2018. Released from prison, sent to a halfway house. So he probably got put in jail by 2003, 2004, so well over a decade in jail, right? Okay, sorry, our firm didn't do a better job for him. They did, we went to the Supreme Court and we got part of his sentence reduced, actually, by the Supreme Court. But let's look at
Okay, you're familiar with the Carlos Ghosn scandal, right? Carlos Ghosn, one of the things that he did that gets mentioned in the press, there's no sign that this is part of the criminal charges or against him, is that he gave a big party at Versailles, right? I think his daughter's wedding or something, and it was because of some Nissan or Renault connection that he could use the palace. So I say, oh, I know that. This is Dennis Kozlowski, who was the chair of a company called Tyco. It was a global conglomerate. And he became famous for giving a Roman orgy-themed birthday party for his wife on the island of Sardinia. It cost $2 million for the birthday party, and the company paid half the price because they invited some customers along. It got mentioned in the press and was one of the signs of excess when he was arrested and prosecuted that they brought him for. He spent a long, there he is, he doesn't look so good in jail, does he? So he spent a long time in jail. Dennis Kozlowski. I once worked for a business here that we sold a company in Japan to another public company, and they eventually became part of Tyco. So I knew people who eventually were working at Tyco when all this happened. Okay, let's look at Joe Naccio. I worked with Joe. Joe was the CEO of Quest. He almost became the CEO of AT&T, major US company. He was a well-known wunderkind, young, bright guy in the telecom industry, and Quest was a really hot company. They were a great client. They eventually merged with US West. And Joe, when the telecom bubble started to end, he kept selling stock. And he said he thought Quest was going to do fine, but he had a lot of inside information suggesting that the business was falling apart. So he was sent to jail for insider trading. That's a mugshot. That's the picture they take of you when you get arrested, right? One front and one side. I mean, I actually knew Naccio. He would have known my name because I did go to Europe with him a couple times. There he is, the ex-con Joe Naccio, being interviewed on TV. A lot of these people went to jail. Richard Scrushy, head of a company called Health South, great entrepreneur. They ran surgery centers all around the US. I once did a deal where we sold them 50 surgery centers from HCA, which was the largest hospital company in the world. And they were not that good a company, frankly, as a counterparty. You worried about them a little bit, so I wasn't so surprised when a year or two later he was accused of a massive financial fraud. There he is, his mugshot. He ended up beating one crime, but he did go to jail. There he is today. He's out of jail. I think he only spent 4 or 5 years in jail. So a lot of these people went to jail. That's the moral of this story. And the public really wanted them to go to jail because investors lost tens of billions of dollars in this crisis. Okay, what was the next big bursting of a bubble, the next big crisis in the global economy? Not 1999, 2000, but the next one.
Global financial crisis.
The global financial crisis, right? In Japan, they call it the Lehman shock, 2007 to 2009. I say 2007, Lehman didn't go under until 2008, but it really did start in 2007, right? If you see, there's a movie, The Big Short, good film, about the financial crisis, right? Okay. Let's see if we can find who went to jail from the global financial crisis. Let's see, is this a picture of, I don't have any. Oh, there he is, that's Angelo Mozillo. He was the CEO of Countrywide Mortgage. They were the biggest home mortgage company, and they went bankrupt. They were bad. They had a lot of lousy mortgages.
symbolic of the mortgage fraud and all the problems in this era. And there he is when he was still CEO. He's smiling. He's got a great tan. They're based out in California. He didn't go to jail. He wasn't prosecuted. He's about as clear a case for fraud, mortgage fraud related prosecution as you could find. He did pay a lot of money, $67 million in fines and penalties and to settle litigation. But the company actually paid a third of it or more because he had an indemnification agreement from the company. If the company had more money, they might have paid the whole thing. But that was all negotiated. And he didn't go to jail. He was not prosecuted. And he's the best I could find. There aren't anyone from the major financial institutions who went to jail as a result of the global financial crisis. And the question is, why? Was there something in these memos that changed? Why has the US gone away from prosecuting CEOs, or successfully prosecuting CEOs? They brought in a huge amount of money after the financial crisis. I'm seeing that countrywide, his companies end up being acquired by Bank of America. Bank of America paid $71 billion in face number in liability related to the mortgage fraud, So that's 100 times what, or it's 1,000 times what Angelo Mozilo paid, right? The company paid in 24 settlements over lots of state and federal liability, but nobody went to jail. And this money was basically funny money, a lot of it. But what these settlements do, they have big numbers. The company gets a tax write-off, so it doesn't really pay as much money. But what you get is you get this lovely press conference. You get a different picture. Instead of the CEO going to jail and the mugshot, you get, drum roll, there, should come on. You get that. Eric Holder, the Attorney General, the first Attorney General under Barack Obama with some of his lieutenants, standing out there announcing that they've recovered tens of billions of dollars from Bank of America. They're doing a good thing for the people. Politically, they think that's enough. And they negotiate for a big number, even if the Bank of America gets a tax write-off, so it doesn't really cost them that much. Even if the money isn't actually given away, it's put in some fund where maybe people can access it, or maybe it goes back to Bank of America if nobody accesses it after a number of years. It may not be real money, but the Attorney General gets a nice press conference. And it's much easier to get companies to settle if you're not threatening to put the CEO in jail, right? So unfortunately, what we've seen in the US is a series of cases where the corporation has responsibility, but not the individual. And that's been very, very common. It's been commented upon to the point where one of the leading financial journalists who won a Pulitzer Prize for writing about the financial crisis, wrote a book recently called The Chicken Shit Club: Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. The Chicken Shit Club is a reference to prosecutors who are too afraid to take on an executive. Why are they afraid to take on an executive? Well, they lose. Executives hire good lawyers. They have money. They invest in the defense. They drag it out. They take it on appeal. They have judges who may look on them sympathetically because the executive comes in and he looks very similar, same age, same socioeconomic background, same college graduate, very sympathetic to the judge. It's natural. So, in fact, there have been many fewer prosecutions
there are other factors as well. It's not just that it's tough to convict executives. But there were a couple things going on. First, after Enron, Arthur Andersen, a major accounting firm, went into bankruptcy or was liquidated because the Justice Department went after them criminally, and it essentially put them out of business. Or at least that's what people remember from it. That may not be the actual reason they went out of business, but that's what people remember. Is if you go after companies and prosecute them criminally, then then it's not a good thing. We only have 4 big accounting firms instead of 5. We'd be much better off if we had 5. We'd have more competition. They would do a better job. They would charge less. It would be less of an oligopoly. So going after Arthur Andersen was seen as a bad thing. All of this stuff about waiving privilege, there was a lot of pushback with that. They said we're being unfair. And there was pushback from that, and the Justice Department pulled back, became less aggressive. There were some major cases where the government lost. The government went after a bunch of partners at KPMG for selling illegal tax shelters. They said this is tax fraud. And they went after them, and they pressured KPMG not to pay their legal expenses so that they could get them to settle. The courts didn't like that. At the end of the day, the government prosecutors got in a lot of trouble for that. Some of them were sanctioned by the court, and their careers were ruined. So the prosecutors see that, and they say, well, we can't be so aggressive going after executives. The courts reinterpreted some of the criminal laws so that more proof was required to go after executives. Another thing that happened is the Justice Department shifted its emphasis because between the first bubble and the second one, we had a major terrorist attack in the United States. We had the 9/11 attack and the World Trade Center being destroyed. And so the Justice Department spent a lot more of its time chasing counterterrorism and invested a lot more of its resources going after terrorists. And if they're using all the forensic accountants to trace money for terrorist funding, then they can't be tracing executives. So there's just a resource problem. And the last thing that happened is a revolving door. Eric Holder and his team all came out of private law firms where they were defense attorneys. And most of them went back to private law firms where they were defense attorneys. And that has always happened to some extent in the United States, but it became more frequent. This became the way, the standard career in Washington, D.C., is that you would go in and out of the government, and if you want to go back into private practice, if you were the unreasonable prosecutor who threw the book at the defendant, the law firm may not want you. There's a famous case of a guy named, and I'll end quickly, but there's a guy named Richard Breeden, who was the chair of the SEC in the 1990s. He couldn't get a job with a law firm or an accounting firm because he was seen as being very, very tough and somewhat unreasonable. And so nobody wanted him. They thought clients would run away if they hired him. So by being friendly, user-friendly, reasonable, go along to get along, there's some sense that Eric Holder and his lieutenants saw themselves as partners of the corporations rather than adversarial to the corporations and to the defendants, much more than they should have. This was much commented on in the US. Why aren't they going after individuals? And as a result, in 2015, we have another memo, the Yates memo, Sally Yates. My co-high clerking for the same justice as I clerked for, Deputy Attorney General, one of the people who was involved in the early, some of the early developments in the transition to the Trump administration. She got a lot of press before Trump fired her in the early days of the Trump administration. But this memo basically says, we're going to go after individuals. We're not going to take a big money payment from the organization and let the individuals scot-free. And if the organization refuses to help us find the individual and get what we need to pin the responsibility on the relevant individuals, we're not going to settle with the organization. We're not going to do the Eric Holder press conference where we take a big headline number and a nice headline in the newspaper about how much money the Justice Department got, unless we can get the individuals. So that is the current policy in the Justice Department. We don't know yet. This memo was written a year and a half before the end of the Obama administration, and really was only beginning to be implemented, so you cannot see many examples. The biggest example is the case of Theranos. Theranos was a medical technology company, had a blood testing technology, and the CEO was a woman named Elizabeth Holmes, superstar in Silicon Valley, and dropped out of Stanford, set up the company, same thing that Bill Gates did, and Steve Jobs and all these people really saw herself in their image. There's only one problem, is the product didn't work. They lied, it was a fraud. They raised almost $1 billion from investors, and the Justice Department is going after her with both guns blazing, and she deserved it. There's not any question of that. Anyway, so I will wrap up. That's just an example of how the compliance environment has changed in the United States. Happy to take questions about the topic or about the program. Thank you very much.